Hey folks, Steve here with a Nations in Arms video for you today. We're going to be looking at an intermission video that uh, will cover a few things, the mechanics that are to come as we start looking to the next scenario that we'll be playing in this series. So it just felt like a good time. I'm starting to set up the 1805 campaign scenario, which could be the longest scenario really in the whole package of the game if you're playing from 1805 to 1814. That's the maximum length through the end of 1814, I think, which is the largest scenario, right? The closest one that we've seen so far was the War of the First Coalition. This one is potentially going to be bigger, or definitely is going to be bigger for a couple of reasons. One is as a campaign game, it has all the other mechanics that so far we've only seen in little bits and pieces, or not at all. So there's going to be more to do as we play through the game. Additionally, we're going to be dealing with a massive number of units on the board, more than anything that we've seen so far, because there will be units pretty much in every country, or most of the countries on the board all the time at any given time, because these campaigns also include all the major powers and their minor allies, even if they're being played neutral. So there's a lot more to think about, and what I don't want to do is do all of this introduction in part one of the campaign. I'd like to start playing the campaign, and you can watch that and enjoy it for what it is, but really focus on learning about all the new things that are going to matter here, or at least talk about them, so that when we hit the campaign, I'm not going to be slowed down by those things. Um, the first thing I should point out is that the mode of play that I'm going to be pursuing here is to consider these campaign sessions as two-player game, as a two-player game. So what does that mean? Well, I'm obviously playing the solitaire, right? And while I do believe that this game can shine as a full-on, 5 or 6 person game or whatever, though the Turkish players probably, the person playing Turkey is not going to have quite as much fun as everybody else, I don't think. Um, you could play it as a much bigger game, much like a Empires and Arms or something like that. I think this game can facilitate that kind of play, but you need that many more players to independently look into the interests of their faction. So Prussia, the Prussian player, wants Prussia to win, and that's going to lead that player to make certain decisions they might not otherwise make. Same thing with Austria and Russia. But my brain can only handle so many fragmentations and lens to play the game. And I feel like if I were to try to play as, all the independent powers, I might just lose my mind a little bit. So I'm not going to do that. Fortunately, the game and its diplomacy rules and all of that supports a two-player game of the Grand Campaign, where it is, Le Grand Empire versus Perfidious Albion, Britain, with all the other major powers being, brought into one alliance or the other, depending on various factors. And that seems a lot easier for me to process as I'm really playing Britain. If I can get Austria, Prussia, Russia into the alliance and keep them, I will do that. I will control their powers if they get knocked out. Fortunately, the game includes some rails to follow, or some guidelines on how to facilitate all of that. So that actually, feels really good. I think we'll be doing that as opposed to 7 personalities that I'm playing, or 5 or whatever. It's just me and myself, France versus Britain, and all the other major powers, playing their role. Now, the tricky bit with some of this is that this game has a much more open diplomacy model than, say, War and Peace. So, I mean, and I'm not an expert on War and Peace. I have read some of the rules and the scenarios and all that. War and Peace has very rigid campaign diplomacy rules, where, like, the Prussians will join the coalition at this time and place, and they will fight, and then they'll switch, and you do all of this kind of stuff that is not necessarily player driven decisions around who aligns with who and what. You're playing to a script. In this game, it is more open. Now, there are fortunately many scenarios included in the playbook that would allow you to start at a later start date, 1809, to play an abbreviated campaign of France versus Prussia, which that one might just be fun to play in addition to this grand campaign when all is said and done. I don't know. We'll see. Um, or just the 1812 Russia campaign. I mean, there's a lot of different options there if you're looking for a very specific situation to play through. But at 1805, we have sort of here's the scenario as we know it, as we all know and love from any other Napoleonic game you've played at 1805. But once we start playing, things could change quite a bit and change over time, and we're not necessarily going to absolutely see everything happen as it historically did in the grand narrative. The cards will help with some of that, sort of steering things in certain directions, um, but it's not guaranteed. So we'll have to watch out for that. And it could very well happen that like France gets the crap beat out of it in 1805 due to crazy die rolls, and like we got to call the 1805 campaign early or something, and we just got to call it quits and switch to a different campaign. That could still happen, but we'll see. So the fact that we're playing it that way, I think, is just something to keep in mind. Like the War of the First Coalition, we had Spain down here in it, we had Prussia in it, and there were very specific rules as to when they left the game, and some of it was kind of random. Britain would come into the situation later in that campaign. So you had this very on rails diplomatic subsystem for that specific scenario. Here, we really will be leveraging the full diplomatic rules, which means that basically every turn, each major power, or in this case, the two players, Britain and France, will be able to target minor countries that are not already aligned for diplomacy, and you can spend money to influence and gain bonuses to that diplomatic attempt. Diplomacy can be kind of hard in some cases. It's not a guaranteed thing. So it does serve as like a money siphon. Like, are you going to throw money at it? Britain obviously has more money, generally speaking, to be trying to do all of that. So there are those rules where you get a free attempt, you can spend money to get bonuses, and then you can pay for a second attempt somewhere and still put more money into that attempt as well for bonuses. And then there's some natural bonuses that certain countries are more likely to align with certain major powers. All that is kind of straightforward, but the key thing is that could be happening frequently, and the coalition will obviously have many cases where they're going to be trying to peel away or to influence minors against France and that sort of thing. The fact that we're playing the way that we're playing as a two-player game also means that major powers like Austria, Prussia, Russia, technically Spain, and Turkey can also be influenced and can then be brought in, which could mean the whole thing where like Prussia waffles about joining the coalition right away. Well, that could change pretty dramatically by Britain being able to pull Prussia in. There might be some rules about when Prussia is allowed to come in, so I might be wrong about some of that. I have to go look. But there's definitely going to be some cases where things are not going to go to the historical script. Because we can do that, things will change. It could mean Britain tries to get Turkey in because Turkey, by the War of the Third Coalition, really didn't get involved in much of anything other than they did fight with Russia for a little bit in the middle of the period. So we could see something like that go one side or the other, a little bit different from history. Now, so that'll be stuff we'll have to watch out for. The other interesting bit is going to be Spain in particular. So as we know, Spain goes through a couple of swapping of alliances over time, much to do with how they feel about the French and their territory and all these things, the complexities of the situation. There are special rules that govern the diplomacy of Spain. The trick is that basically after 1808, it is possible for the coalition, either via card play or other diplomatic influences, to take Spain out of the French alliance. And then if there are French units in Spain when that happens, then they have a liberation war. The liberation war is interesting because what it requires is that France, trying to fight the Spanish with a liberation war, France would need to control Madrid and all of its ports. So Saint Sebastian, La Corona, Barcelona, Valencia, Cartagena, and Cadiz. I think those are all the ports. It's not every fortress, interestingly enough. I think it's every port is how you conquer Spain in that situation. So it's not like conquering a different major power where and that's something we should talk about, but just know that Spain is different. If we get into a liberation war as France with Spain, we need to control their capital and all their ports to be able to conquer them and put them back under. I think Napoleon put Joseph in charge, his brother, something like that. The historical narrative for this is basically like, you know, Spain is France's ally. By 1808, Spain is in trouble and needs French support. So then Spain, after 1808, is like, and in fact, France can't even send French units into Spain. No other units in the alliance can be in Spain but Spanish units. That's part of the rule. After 1808, or after I think it's spring 1808, France can send help down here. The historical narrative being that the Spanish were starting to get pushed back, I think, and France sent forces down there to support them. And then in the process of that, eventually what would happen is some political, diplomatic finagling happened such that um, France kind of France sort of toppled the Spanish government and had Joseph in there, and basically the Spanish didn't like that eventually, and you have this liberation war. So that'll be kind of a tricky, uh, ulcer, right? The Spanish ulcer could take place here. The other thing that will occur is that the French probably will end up fighting guerrillas in Spain. Now, guerrillas are special units. We haven't seen them yet, but they're really sneaky because they'll show up and they'll sit on supply lines, maybe back to France. Regardless, if you have a bunch of French armies down here or even further deeper, and these militia or guerrillas show up behind the line, they're going to cut off supply. They're going to be a real nuisance. They're not like, they can be dispersed and defeated easily enough, but they keep coming back and they keep causing trouble. So there's this whole kind of mini game that is going to take place in Spain potentially. And in fact, if you want to just play that experience, like that sounds really interesting to you, there is actually a dedicated scenario that like you're only playing in Spain and then I think a little bit of like southern France. Um, that it's just the Spanish ulcer scenario. So if you really want to play that as a distinct thing, as a mini, like it's a long scenario, but it's a very small cut, right? It's condensed. You're only playing this for a long time, or it's several years of gameplay. Um, you can do that if you want to. So I could see where we might do that if, for some reason, in our campaign we never really get the Liberation War for one reason or another. Maybe that'd be fun to play as well and just kind of show that off. Now, the other thing that will matter here is we'll eventually probably see more of Eastern Europe than we have previously. So, the War of the First Coalition, the Second Coalition scenarios are almost all uh, entirely either in Western Europe or Central Europe. But as we start looking east, things get a little different. So I think we're very used to seeing rivers and fortresses in close proximity in Germany or even France. We see a little bit how in France, the French could outmaneuver an enemy in their own territory that had a lot of flat open ground. But when we look east, we see there's a lot of coalition held, or what will maybe usually be coalition held, flat open ground with some pretty sparse areas. In fact, you see like there's this whole gap right here between, there's some forts on the periphery, but Styria is pretty flat and open. And in fact, anyone who's opposed to Austria moving in there is going to have to drop a detachment or a supply depot to get to Vienna, unless they've gone the southern route and they've for sure taken Graz, and then went to Vienna. So there's a kind of a weird sort of chain of fortresses that you see that split Austria in half, but certain angles are going to require greater supply infrastructure to approach. And then that extends out to Even further out east to the Balkans, you can kind of see where the terrain starts to get choppy in the Balkans. And then, when we start looking at Russia, it may be a while before we're really worried about that, but you can see Poland is nothing but flat, clear terrain for the most part, with some fortresses. And then, just to kind of hone in on Russia for a second, you can see, I think it's maybe even worth its own video to be talking about, what does it take to get supply out to Moscow, uh, or even St. Petersburg, because Moscow is way out here, right? So where's your supply path? Well, you could get supply to Tula, but then you need a detachment or a depot between Smolensk and Tula, or between Smolensk and Moscow proper if you're going to go beeline it. There's no highways here, the same way we might see in a World War II game even. So you could maybe go Vilna, Minsk, 1, 2, 3, 4 to Vitebsk, then Smolensk, and then you've got to drop something off, and then go to Moscow. But all the while, you have all this flat terrain out here that will have Russians in it, Cossacks, light cavalry, looking to cut supply lines, destroy raid depots in your rear if you're the French, and cause a bunch of problems. So, like, where in the past of these scenarios we've managed to enjoy somewhat condensed terrain where you don't have to go very far before you're fighting something, in the East, it could be very different. And in fact, the positioning of units will matter, and probably the chit pull order will matter a whole lot out there because, can you cover your supply line appropriately? Can you intercept? Can you avoid combat? All of that will make penetrating Russia, I think, very difficult, as it should be, and we all know what happened historically. So eventually, we'll see that as well. In terms of the political control of this stuff, you can see uh, Italy exists, the Kingdom of Italy exists. Northern Italy is largely in French control, except for Venice, which is annexed by Austria. Prussia holds a number of minor, the most significant ones probably being Cleves, and the Austrians have a much reduced presence in the HRE right now, where um, they're allied with the papacy, and also Thuringia here. There's a couple of minor states that we can create. So there's a whole section of the rules around this. So France can create the Confederation of the Rhine if they can get control of Cleves. And then I think they can do, they might need Thuringia as well. So those two, so defeating Austria and Prussia to get those provinces. They can also do Westphalia, but I think that requires control of Hesse and Magdeburg, which is technically at start a national territory of Prussia. So we can definitely do those historical things and create those client states, but we don't yet have control of them as the French, so we would have to do that. But you can see, the French are even allied to Bavaria, oddly enough. So there's a whole, something I'm going to have to look at is, does this, you can create the Kingdom of Bavaria, but it requires like giving them Tyrol, but Austria still has control of Tyrol, I'm pretty sure. So there's something a little bit weird there, but in the setup charts or the power charts, Bavaria is noted as a French ally in this scenario. So I guess that's a little bit of weirdness we have to paper over. Sweden is actually in it as a British ally, as you can see up there with the red markers. So it's a little bit different, but you can kind of see the trending narrative from the wars of the First and Second Coalition, how things are kind of coming together politically here. Yeah, at least without the clutter of all the armies that are going to be set up, the forces on the map, it made sense to kind of show what that looks like without getting too crazy with the map set up. Final thing I should talk about quickly is the conquering rules. So the conquering of minor countries is still largely going to be the same type of thing that we've seen in other scenarios where you don't conquer the minor power until the winter, which makes it weird because it takes longer to actually like fully conquer a minor country for like annexing purposes. You can still take military control of them, but you have to wait until winter before they are really pieced out for whatever reason. Um, Major powers are different. And in fact, major powers can, quote unquote, peace out um, during the sort of end phase of any turn, so long as the right conditions are fulfilled, which this the pure base game mechanic that covers all cases, no matter what version of the game you're playing is, each major power has their capital and then key cities, locations that you would also need to control for them to peace out. So there's a little bit of just that political, like, hey, we've had enough. We're going to peace out. We're going to sign out of this. You're not going to like annex Austria, right? That's not going to happen. So, like Austria, you would control Vienna and then Budapest and Prague. So, those are the three key areas you need to take to knock Austria out of a war. And there's an exception where Prague or Budapest could be ignored if you've eliminated or demoralized every Austrian army in their national territory. And I guess if they don't have any army in their national territory, then you just need the capital. So this is where you get the, Bonaparte defeats the Austrian army. They're demoralized. They got their ass kicked. Maybe you eliminate a different one, or the other army is like far afield, and you take Vienna. That's going to cause Austria to peace out. So that's kind of how that works. Now, there is the potential for that major power to say, no, I'm going to fight on, despite you doing that. But you then basically have 2 more turns to get out of a peace out condition. If you fail to do that, so you said, no, I'm going to fight it out, but then you fail to make a difference, the number of peace clauses you get as the conquering power is doubled. So normally it's 4 clauses if they say, no, I'm going to fight on, and still you beat them. Then it becomes 8 clauses, and without getting too deep, because this video would be even longer, basically each clause can allow you to like annex some territory or ask for money or force them. You can spend a couple clauses and make them join your alliance later, which is what Napoleon did with Austria and I think Prussia eventually. So that's kind of how that works. And regardless if we're playing a 7-player game, a 6 or 7-player game, or a 2-player game, that mechanic functions like that. So, if we can knock powers out of the war, and then depending on how badly they try to fight it off or how well we did in that war, we could get more peace clauses and then manipulate the grand strategic political diplomatic situation to our favor as France. That's obviously what they want to be doing in the early parts of the war. And then you could have something like vice versa, like maybe Russia gets into Prussia and then blah, blah, blah. The same sort of thing could happen the other way too. But we in theory, would see France knocking Austria out of the war as part of the 1805 campaign, right? That's the historical thing that's going to potentially happen. But maybe the coalition will do better and that won't happen. Now, because we're playing a 2-player game, there is a special, I think it's optional if I remember correctly. Like I don't think you have to play with this, but there's a alliance credit system that you can follow, and this is detailed just as well in the Banania rules, that it's kind of a stand-in for a broader multiplayer game where, like, in a 5-player game or a multiplayer game, whoever's controlling, say, Austria, like you're the Austrian player, you could come to terms with the French player via other means. You could say, hey, I don't want to be outright conquered. I don't want to deal with all those peace clauses. Can we come to some other more reasonable agreement, sir, and I will peace out with you, kind of thing. Now, in a multiplayer game, the players can decide how they want to do that. Again, it's kind of that empires and arms kind of thing where the players have much more open diplomacy to say, no, let's change it up, right? Let's just not follow the path of history. Let's work something out a little bit differently. In a 2-player game, you won't have that, which if you were just playing without this optional system of alliance credit, the only way that alliances could change is by conquering them, or the diplomacy thing where you make them switch sides or whatever. And you don't, and those are 2 extremes, right? You don't necessarily have this white peace, hey, let's chill out kind of thing, which is actually how I think Russia came to terms with Napoleon after, I don't know if it was 1807. I'm going to feel bad if I'm getting these years wrong. Something like that. But Russia was like, okay, I think we're done. I don't want to do this right now. let's just come to a peace for the time being, though they would eventually fight some more. So there's this alliance credit system, which I've created my own little player aid card for, because the game doesn't have one. What you do have, I should show this, is a thing up here that you can use, but I don't really I don't want to use that. I want to use my own. So I have this here. So what I've done is I've got the sheet for each of the unplayed major powers: Austria, Russia, Prussia, Spain, and Turkey. And then who they're allied to: red for Britain, blue for France. This credit value. You start at 7. So Spain is at 7. Russia is at 7. Austria is at 9. Because you also get 1 point per minor country allied for that power. So Austria is allied to the papacy and Thuringia. That's 2. So they go from 7 to 9 as their default alliance credit. And what this alliance credit is meant to represent is the general commitment to the alliance that they are a part of. So 7's a pretty good number. So how does that change? Well, and I copied this table out of the Banania rules and just replicated it here as a quick reference. There's some, I guess, obvious things that would affect this. So, if you're losing, your allied miners are losing their capitals, that's going to bring you down. If you lose your capital, that's going to make you come down. If your buddies are losing their capital, that's going to go down. But if you're doing well, that'll make you go back up. If your forces suffer a major defeat, which, as best as I can tell, I think that's meant to mean like a major battle, meaning a very, very large battle with lots of units, you lose with demoralization happening, which might not always happen, so I don't know. If there were a major victory, defeat, even if you weren't a part of it, so Austria would be bummed out if Russia or vice versa suffered major defeat. So there's sort of a net track where, like, again, if Austria gets its butt kicked, Austria feels really bad about it, and Russia feels a little bit bad about it. And then you can see, like, if army markers are destroyed, then that's another factor. But you could spend money to try to bump it back up. So you're basically like, this is another money sink maybe for Britain. Spend the money to try to keep, Austria and Russia in it. Yeah. So I don't know how well this is going to work, because when I look at these numbers and I try to think about, like, how does this go, and I think about this like in terms of Russia, like, let's think about, like, capital of an allied minor. So they don't have any. We're not going to take a capital of Russia, but okay, -1 for Vienna being controlled, so they're down to 6. Maybe some major defeats. Well, yeah, it could suffer its own defeat, right? Kutuzov, it gets defeated or something. So then they'd be down to 4. Maybe the other Austrian armies get beat up, so now they're down to 3. If the army markers themselves are actually lost, then maybe you're hovering around 1 to 2. But then I don't know how you get, I guess you'd have to then, like, I guess in that example, right, by the time the War of the Third Coalition finishes up, maybe Russia's down to here, and then, you get into the War of the Fourth Coalition with Prussia. Prussia gets all that same stuff happening to them. Russia's like, okay, I've just seen Austria and then Prussia get their asses kicked up and down the continent. I'm done. I'm down to 0. And when you go to 0, you basically sign a white peace, I think is what it is. It's a little bit different than that, but basically it's along those lines. So yeah, it's as soon as the alliance credit is down to 0, that major power would leave the alliance, becomes neutral, and must sign a peace with every major power and minor country at war with the bloc it was allied to at the end of the season. Um, and as such, even while neutral, the joining major power is still subject to the peace clauses dictated by the other side. So this is kind of a different way for a power to just leave the alliance without you actually conquering it. And so again, that's like making up for the fact, or if you want a historical example of what that would represent. Again, I think it's Russia leaving the coalition after the defeat of Prussia, or I'm gonna have to look up the dates. I'm gonna have to do a cut here and go look it up again and make sure I'm describing that correctly. But that's how you can handle some of these things. But I think many powers are simply not going to drop out from that alone. You're going to have to conquer them by taking their capital and the key cities. It's just that this is going to be how Russia comes in or out, or maybe how Turkey comes in and out because of that alliance credit. I don't think it's going to be a huge thing to watch for. What I am worried about is that I'm going to remember to move the alliance credit when the events actually happen. Okay, I did look it up, and yes, so in the aftermath of the War of the Third Coalition, where Austria had exited, that just merged into what we know as the War of the Fourth Coalition when Prussia joined the hostilities, but Russia continued to fight, right? And I remembered correctly. I just wasn't explaining it well. So then, as the French moved through Prussia, they eventually fought some battles with the Russians, the battles of Eylau and then Friedland, which were French victories. The Russians were defeated, and they signed the Treaty of Tilsit to exit the war and join the continental system, which is something we're going to bring up here in a second. So again, if we were looking at like the alliance credit, we would see the Russian alliance credit start to drop through the War of the Third Coalition, and then continue to drop with the War of the Fourth Coalition, with Austria being defeated, armies containing Russians being defeated, obviously, with Austerlitz and everything else. That would start to tick away at the alliance credit for Russia, and then you wouldn't get a reset. The Russian credit would continue to be what it's at as the French defeat the Prussians, which would contribute to further drops in alliance credit for the Russians. And then finally, those battles, those historical battles of Eylau and Friedland would be the final nails in the coffin, which would bring Russia to zero alliance credit. And then they'd sign a peace treaty, and France would ask them to join the continental system as a part of that, very likely, right? So that's the historical narrative. But if we were not playing with alliance credit, there really is not a very good game mechanism for Russia to leave any coalition, to leave the coalition alliance as is. So I think if you were playing this as a two-player game and you wanted to play it where at least the historical situations could actually occur, like the Treaty of Tilsit, I think you do need to try to play with the alliance credit system. I'm just worried that when I go to play and the significant events happen that would affect the credits, that I'll forget to move those counters over there, because I haven't been doing that, right? We've not been using the system, and it's just one of those extra things like, oh yeah, we did fight that battle and we did do the thing, and I need to adjust the markers. Now, major battles are kind of a big deal. We use the tactics cards. All of that should remind me that it's special, as well as capitals are in general very special, so maybe it won't be so bad. With that, let's wrap this video up by talking quickly about the victory conditions. So the victory conditions in a two-player game are more or less straightforward. I do recommend you take a look at the rules, the Banania rules, or the rules as written, and you check out the multiplayer victory conditions. They're pretty cool, because if it's like, oh, Prussia, what does Prussia need to win? Well, they need to gain control of all of this territory that Prussia was historically interested in, and it might mean for Prussia to actually get all the way up to those conditions that they are going to be on the coalition. They might need to join France for a while to pick up some other stuff, that kind of thing, which again I think it leans into that sort of empires in arms like feel of each faction has these things that it wants to do, very specific things that they want to do that give them incentives to, be a part of the coalition, but maybe also give them incentives to leave the coalition or whatever, depending on what the table state really is, which I think is very interesting. So definitely take a look at those rules. I'm not going to reiterate them all here. We're going to focus on the two-player rules, which are a bit more straightforward. Just to read these out loud so that we're all on the same page. Basically, the game can end in an immediate victory if Britain is conquered. Now, there is an argument online where someone tries to say, hey, why don't you just, as the French, cross the channel, take London, conquer Britain, and win the game? That's not going to happen. Mathematically, if you work out the scenario required for France to do that, it is highly unlikely to actually occur. And you really are like blowing the whole game on trying to do that. And I don't think it's worthwhile. If I were playing a multiplayer game or even a two-player game and my French opponent wanted to try to do that, I would welcome it because he would fail, and that would be that. He would have really screwed up his game. I don't think we're going to do that. It's unlikely that will occur, but that is one way the game can end. The other, which would be another French victory, is if the continental system has been established for at least two winter victory phases. And I think it's been in the rules somewhere that like they need to be consecutive. I might need to double check that. But the continental system, what the rules mean is not just to have anything as part of the continental system. You need basically Russia to be part of the continental system, Prussia to be part of the continental system, Denmark and all this to be part of the continental system. Obviously, all of France. I think Portugal as well, Spain, all the way. It's actually listed in the book somewhere, and I'm going to get it wrong here. It's a not insignificant thing to actually achieve. So I would watch out about actually putting that into place. So you have to imagine you have defeated, or via some peace treaty mechanism, conquered most of Europe solidly with every port that matters under the continental system. Whether that means it's controlled by France directly, it's annexed, it's an allied minor country, which is a satellite that's just part of the continental system by default, and any major powers like Prussia and Russia are committed to the continental system, likely due to peace treaties and alliances. So that's going to be a tough thing. I think it's going to be a tough thing to have, and it's have at any point the full continental system implemented, and even harder to keep it established for two winter victory phases. So we'll call that unlikely. I mean, I think the French would love to win that way, but I'm not sure that's going to happen, but they'll certainly strive to do it. And then the other automatic, these are automatic French victories and automatic Empire victories. The other is it is winter 1813 or later, and France has conquered Austria, Prussia, and Russia, and is allied to or has conquered Spain, and all are currently at peace with France. So this is sort of a different angle on what a French strategic victory looks like, where let's see, you has conquered Austria. Okay, that could have happened at any point in the game. Conquered Prussia, likewise, and conquer Russia, which means that we need to have gone into an actual 1812 campaign in Russia and won, basically do what Napoleon didn't do, which is actually like win a war, win that campaign in Russia. And then if he's done that, all three of those guys have been conquered. Spain has to be allied or conquered, which means you either avoid the Dos de Mayo, War of Liberation, and they're just your ally, or you've won the War of Liberation and have conquered Spain, right? So you got to win that theater. And then all are currently at peace with France, which means that you've conquered these powers all in the right cadence, that you're either allied to them due to a mandatory alliance peace clause, or you're still in the mandatory peace period and they're neutral or you're not at war with them. All of that is in theory achievable. Austria and Prussia more easily able to be conquered because of their proximity and the ability to keep them due to peace clauses underneath mandatory peace. I think the Spanish ulcer is probably a problem, and then again, the whole Russian campaign is probably a problem. But you see the three different paths to automatic victory for the French. Knock out the British outright. Do the continental system, so indirectly via trade, knocking Britain out. That's sort of what that represents. And then just the pure military victory of conquering all of Europe in some form, or knock Russia down a peg, which they did not achieve historically. The automatic coalition victory, British victory, is if France is conquered. So, they likewise have a similar thing where if you take Paris and a certain number of other key cities are taken or armies are destroyed or demoralized, then we could see France conquered, which I'm trying to think if this is what the game thinks is the historical victory. It might be. That France was conquered. I would assume so, because when you start talking about the final campaigns in France in 1813, 1814, like, I think that's kind of how the game would interpret it, as an automatic coalition victory, because they got into Paris. They took the key cities. I think they did. Now, if for some reason France is never conquered, there's no automatic victory. So if that's the case, then at the 1814 winter season, so the final turn in phase, France wins if she controls every capital city fortress X in the whole Grand Empire territory. Failing that, the coalition wins. So if France has not been able to do any of those other things, but has been able to retain its quote unquote Grand Empire, then they'll win. If the coalition has not outright destroyed France, but has started to erode the Grand Empire, then that would be considered like a minor coalition victory. And when we talk about what counts as the Grand Empire, there are things on the map that help us understand what that is. So, like, it says underneath Genoa, there's this little script here. It might be hard to read at this angle and zoom level, but French 1805 and Grand Empire. So it's part of the Grand Empire. So is Tuscany. So is the papacy, actually. Let's see. Is Lombardy? No, Lombardy is not. Interestingly enough, Piedmont. I think somewhere in the rule book there is an explanation for this. Geneva, Neuchâtel is. Flanders is. Hanover is not. Holland is. So there's a few key, there are some key provinces. I'm not going to bother putting the red bingo chits on these yet. I think that would only matter when we're in the late stages of the game to worry about, like, what is the game situation. But that's the victory, right? So maybe not too dissimilar from some of the earlier scenarios where France needs to retain control of certain territories throughout the game. That will be a factor towards the tail end. But in between, France would like to achieve an outright victory. Coalition, likewise, would like to achieve an outright victory. I think the historical case is a automatic coalition victory. And you'll notice that, yes, the game ends at winter 1814. That is basically the War of the Sixth Coalition, ending. The 100 Days, the War of the Seventh Coalition, with Waterloo and all of that, is actually its own scenario, which we will look to play after this grand campaign is all said and done. So there you go, guys. That's the intermission. Really long video, but I wanted to explain all these things about the campaign before we actually play it, so that when I appear on camera next or when we're on camera again for this series, it will just be playing the scenario and not trying to explain so much of it. So consider this your intermission, a part 0 for the campaign. Hope it's informative. Hope it gets you hyped for the rest of it. And we'll see you in the next one. Take care. Keep gaming.